Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Marvin Baumann, and this is the second episode in my tautology video series, this time on the topic of human perception. This will be, to my mind, a really important and foundational topic, which is why I've chosen it as the first full-length lecture in the series. And yes, I hope you can take a lot of way from this. And it's supposed to be a sort of interdisciplinary journey, at the end of which I try to lay out how I view perception based on all of the learnings we did beforehand. But before we jump into this, first off, I'd like to shape your expectations of how you should approach learning what the thing I'm trying to present. So first off, I recommend actually you consider watching this video at a higher speed if this works for you, if you can listen faster, because I feel like this not only is the video going faster, but it helps you stay focused and keep attention and makes the video more interesting, so consider doing that. So this will be an intensely interdisciplinary lecture. So my main point is not to have the greatest amount of detail in all of these different subfields, because we could get lost in all of this. And also, I don't claim to be any sort of expert in any of the fields. But to me, it's really important to try to draw the connections and then try to generate a more holistic picture, which starts to emerge once you draw these connections. And also, I would like to invite you to work alongside me and being really active in when you listen and when you watch this, in drawing these connections and learning how to draw these connections, since I think this is sort of a muscle which you can build, and I think it's not done enough in generally, and it's really helpful. So yeah, that's how you should view this interdisciplinary journey, which we will go on to. And since human perception is such an intimate topic, since it's literally how you view the world and why it is that you view the world this way and not the other way, this is far from being only a theoretical subject. So while this lecture might seem theoretical, I would like to invite you to try to learn to understand and feel how it works in your own body, in your own mind, right? So perception is sort of an embodied experience. Thus, it's not merely learned through theoretical knowledge, but you have to develop a sort of intuition. And funnily enough, you have to learn to perceive your own perception in the way which I try to present here. So yes, you don't have to remember any particular detail, any particular fact. Of course, the theoretical knowledge is interesting, is helpful, and this helps us establish how perception works. But to me, it's more important that you try to understand the holistic picture which I'm trying to paint. And then you try to sort of learn to see this in your own life. So in the following days after this lecture, please try to spot this sort of dynamic in your own way of perceiving the world. And yes, it's funny, you can use this very topic of perception to learn practically how perception works, since now that you are beginning to learn at least my view on perception, you can use this to investigate your perception and see whether it works this way or not. And I think this is a really fruitful exercise. And also, to me, this is exemplary for how I also view learning in general, that there are a lot of topics which are taught merely theoretically, and by definition I almost feel it's only possible to teach theoretically, but to really understand something you have to learn to embody it and feel it and understand it by observing and sort of by just becoming aware that this is how you view the world. At least that's mind as we go along. Right, so starting off, what is perception? So the definition, the Wikipedia definition, is perception, which is a word from Latin, is the organization, identification, interpretation of sensory information in order to represent and understand the presented information or environment. And notwithstanding the linguistic etymology, which merely says it's gathering, receiving, I'm trying to argue that perception, and I would also say this is a general consensus in literature, that perception is really an active process of mostly interpreting sensory information, and also information. It's not only about taking in outside information, but also it's about being aware of what you think and also feel actually in your own body, and then sort of your mind shapes this thing which we call perception out of all of these things by interpreting all of them in a particular context. Right. So let's start out with biology and neuroscience view on perception. So first off, I'd like to go a little bit into sort of the sensory systems, the organs. As you all know, we have eyes, we have ears, we have a nose, we have skin, and also we have sort of feelings inside of our body, right? So I'll just lay these out to have some basic biological understanding. First off, eyes. So arguably, this is the primary sense in humans, also primates or monkeys. And seeing works via the eyes, as you guys know. It's actually really interesting. So, as you know, light travels through the pupil inside of the eyeball and hits your retina, which is basically the backside of your eyeball. And you might have heard that in the retina you have these things which are called cones or rods, which are these sort of pencil looking things. And light actually travels first through sort of a neural layer, which means a layer of neurons. It travels through, and then it hits sort of these rods and these cones. And these cones, they react to the different types of lights which come in. And you have different sort of rods and cones. So cones sense color. So as you might know, we have 3 different types of cones. And one type of cone recognizes red light, green light, and blue light. So 3 types. And also then we have these rods which are responsible for sort of black and white seeing, which helps you see at night since they are more sensitive to light. And the reason why the light passes first through sort of this neural layer and then gets to this pigment layer, I think it's called, is because this way light cannot escape via reflection back into the eye, which would then cause optical illusions and so on. So basically, light works by being received inside of the eyeball and then interacting chemically, physically with these sort of rods. And the reason for this is that light has different wavelengths, meaning different energies. And the cones are tuned to different sort of wavelengths. So at different wavelengths, they tend to react more strongly chemically, and thus send a more stronger neural or electrical signal through the neurons. And all of these signals then go through the optic nerve inside of the human brain and then are processed further, which I will go into later. So since seeing is the primary sense, I will later on try to lay out how the visual cortex works in more detail. But basically, we take in some physical information, we translate it into neural information or signal inside of our brain, and then it will be processed further. And this is a common theme which we have for all of our sensing organs. So for example, the ear is also really an interesting organ, since sound travels inside of the earlobe into the ear, and then we have the eardrum right here. And then we have these small, tiny bones which transmit sort of the vibration of the eardrum onto this snail-looking thing, which is called the cochlea. And the cochlea is really interesting. It's filled with a sort of fluid. And inside of the cochlea, on the inside skin, you have all those small little hairs. And the basic idea is that the vibration of the hairs, which happen via vibration of inside of the fluid, they get picked up as signals, which are then sort of sent via nerve pathways into the human brain, and then they are further processed. So it's again the same thing. Basically, you have a physical signal, you have oscillations in the air density, which is sound, and this enters the ear, and through a complex process, which is really interesting. You can also read the text here. This is processed and converted into signal information. Now this is similar for nose and tongue. I won't go into this more deeply. The skin also quite similar. The skin sort of has this sensitivity, and you have nerve cells all around your skin, and in this way you're able to perceive different sorts of things. You can perceive touch. You're more sensitive in some areas than in others. Some pieces of skin you have actually higher spatial resolution, meaning you can more easily differentiate two closely located points on your skin if they are pressed. So for example, on the back side of your foot, you have less spatial resolution than, let's say, on the back side of your hand. And also you can perceive temperature, which is basically heat flow, which heats up your skin. And again, you have nerve cells which then send this signal up into the human brain. And also one interesting thing I like is the sensing of an inner bodily feeling. And particularly, this is also relevant for the perception of human emotions. Because emotions, at least I would frame it this way, are in part an interpretation of how you feel your body inside, plus what you're thinking at the current moment, plus what is sort of the context around. And the emotion that then you seem to feel, and it seems to come natural, is just sort of a interpretation or a combination of all of these different signals into a perception of your own emotion. And there's this really interesting picture which you can see here, where people have actually measured for different sort of emotions which parts of their body feel actually it's light versus heavy. So when people are, let's say, sad, they feel really sort of heavy and pressed down in general. And when people feel happy, on the other hand, they're really elated. They feel light, so let's say. And then I want to point out this really interesting phenomenon, which is called misattribution of arousal, which can sometimes occur when people have a certain bodily feeling, but then you add a specific different context, which leads them to misinterpret the bodily feeling as a different emotion than how it was actually elicited. So meaning, let's say if you're sort of in love or if you're aroused, your heart beats faster, but actually the bodily feeling is to some degree similar to when you're sort of not fearful, but yeah, fearful, let's say. And they actually had this experiment where people would walk across a huge bridge and their heart would be pounding faster. And afterwards, these men which did it, they talked to women, and they manipulated the experiment in such a way to show that sometimes this perception of feeling fearful because of the height of the bridge caused these men to misattribute feeling more attracted to the women than the control group would feel to these same women. So all of this is to say that the feeling of your internal bodily states is a major part of your interpretation or your perception of your own emotions. So I think that's really important. So that's why I added this in here. Now, let's get into some neuroscience, and with particular focus in this case on on the visual cortex. So how do, after light has entered the eyes, how do we actually process these signals? So the visual cortex is on the back side of the head. It's called also the occipital cortex, and it's a really interesting thing, because the way it works is it has this sort of hierarchical sensing and sense making of visual concepts, which means, as you can see in this graphic, this line right here is the optic nerve, and it passes into the visual cortex, which is on the back side of the brain. And the visual cortex is separated into different areas, and they call them V1, V2, and so on. And you have a progressive processing of the visual signals for ever more abstract shapes, let's say. So V1 receives signals at first, and they sort of process basic features like edges or contrast or spatial frequency and so on. So really basic stuff. And then as you go further along this hierarchy, you sort of start to, at first you only see some edges or something like this, and then you start to integrate this into whole forms. And then as you move further up, you see, okay, maybe this is a ball, or maybe this is like a human head, and so on. So there's this interesting hierarchical processing going on. And there's also, interestingly enough, a similarity to how modern neural networks in this sort of AI, machine learning neural networks work, which are used for visual processing or for, let's say, understanding images, where they actually also have this hierarchical layering, and you can actually then look at each layer and understand that the most basic, the first layers, that's what you see on the left. These are sort of it's called kernel filters, or whatever you want to call it, but basically they are in charge of perceiving edges. And then towards the middle of the hierarchy, you start to perceive sort of full or partial objects, let's say. So it's a bit hard to tell, but sort of some sort of circle here, some sort of more complex shapes. And then on the outer pieces of the hierarchy, you actually have full concepts. So some of these filters, they could be perceiving, let's say, dog faces or cat faces or cars or whatever else. So it's really interesting that sort of modern machine learning methods mirror this sort of hierarchical visual processing, which we do in our brain as well. Yes, and also apparently there are two sort of pathways in this hierarchy. So one that's called the ventral stream, which processes object recognition and form representation, and the dorsal stream, which handles spatial relationships and motion. And also quite interesting to me is, if you look at the upper side of the visual cortex, this is where sort of the visual cortex connects onto the motor cortex, so that the piece of the brain which is responsible for how you can, for moving, let's say, for moving your body. Motor means moving. And sort of actually the visual part of your brain that is responsible for motion and understanding motion works together with the motor part of your brain, which is responsible for moving your body, to get this seamless interaction and to help you move through the world and, I don't know, chase after a ball when you play football or something like this, right? And just to show you how complex the the brain is, it has this interesting graphic. It's called Your High-Tech Brain. I will link it below. And sort of he tries to show like all of these complex things which are going on in the brain. and particularly on the back side of the brain is the visual cortex. And here he shows sort of the different V1, V2, whatever, which are responsible for, so for example, apparently V2B is responsible for recognizing humans, recognizing emotions and hands and so on. V1 is just general shapes. And let's say V6, V7, he says is about hand-eye coordination. So yeah, this is an interesting thing. I will link it down below and you can have a look. Also interesting in this regard, similar to how I taught you that the visual and the motor cortex are beside each other, there's also this boundary region of sort of the linguistic part of your brain, which handles speech and language and so on, and the visual part of your brain. And also once you learn to read, a sub-proportion of your visual cortex actually specializes in recognizing text. And what's so interesting about this is at the boundary of the visual and the linguistic centers in the brain, you will have an sort of an encoding or representation of the same object. So let's say sort of this is a mug, right? And you can see this mug. And sort of one piece of your brain knows how different mugs look like, and another piece of your brain knows this word mug and cup and so on, and all these associated words which are quite closely related. All of these are represented somewhere in the brain, and also the visual information of how a cup looks like is also somewhere. And interestingly enough, those two representations, they lay beside each other in this case, where there's sort of a direct transference from the visual concept to the linguistic concept. So just thinking about the brain this way, it then makes sense that once you see a cup, it's really easy to remember this word cup or mug or whatever, since a region that's really, really close to what has been now activated since you've seen it is also tends to be activated. So basically, so basically the red piece here is the picture of mugs and cups, and the blue piece here is sort of the space where those words are encoded. And once one thing lights up in the brain, let's say, it's really easy that the things which are close to it also light up, which means it's really easy for you to remember this word given that you see it. So yeah, this is some background on how sort of this neuroscience tends to behave. Of course, it's infinitely more complex, and I'm also not an expert, but I think this is worthwhile nonetheless. And now you have some idea of how this sort of processing sometimes or works in the case of the visual system. Now, to finish up this section on neuroscience, there's another interesting thing which I'd like to introduce you to you, which is called the predictive theory of the brain, and it's from a guy called Andy Clark. Also, if you want to, there's a popular science book on this. It's called The Experience Machine. Also quite interesting. It's more like popular science, so it's easy to read. And the basic claim is this. The brain, as used to be the consensus, the brain is not merely processing information and not merely processing sort of signals that come inside of your eyes and so on, but it's actually using some sort of internal world model, so an internal understanding of how the world works and looks and so on, to generate the experience which you're having, to sort of, that the picture you're seeing right now is of course grounded in what your physical eyes are seeing and the physical light that's hitting your eyes and the processing of these signals inside of your visual cortex. But it's also generated by this, in a step-by-step manner or second-to-second manner, by this generative model, this generative world understanding model inside of your brain, that sort of tries to predict what is the next signal, the next image, let's say, that I will see in the next second, right? And yes, so it's really interesting. So there's this great book which I can just recommend, but it's really dense. It's called Culture, Mind and Brain. And on page 55, they have also this quote of the construction of semantic knowledge through perceptual abstraction and emerging predictive brain framework, in which the brain does not simply await inputs and produce outputs, but rather maintains a dynamic and generative model of the world that anticipates sensory experience and responds to unexpected discrepancies. So I will try to now explain what this means. Basically, the claim is that because of this generative model in your brain, so basically he says perception and sensing is a controlled hallucination, which means everything that you're seeing right now is sort of a movie which your brain generates, but this movie is grounded in the sensory information which you get, and whenever some sort of piece of the generative image is not correct, then the brain uses the sensory information it gets from the outside to correct this error, and this correction of errors then means that sort of you're learning a better and better and better world model. So you continually improving your understanding your world model. All right. And also on a micro level, this means that, so this is more of a hypothesis, but there's also this understanding that even individual neurons or groups of neurons try to predict the next input, and that learning actually happens by failing to predict the input correctly, and then using sort of the like how far you were wrong in your predictions, or how far the neurons were wrong in their prediction, to adapt let's say the programming of the neuron to learn a more accurate representation of the world. And if any of you guys are familiar with machine learning and neural networks, you might already see that this is really, really similar to sort of this approach in machine learning, where you have loss functions and then you have stochastic gradient descent to minimize errors and thus learn neural networks. So I think this sort of analogy is really interesting, and also there's, to some degree at least, some consensus on the true factor of this, even though like it's not maybe the whole picture, let's say. So just quickly, I don't want to go too deeply into this, but again, they say sort of there's a hierarchical relationship of neurons are connected to each other, and they abstract different topics. So for example, as I said before, like visual processing, and at each layer of the hierarchy, it's trying to predict what the bottom layer that comes before it will send next, and once, if it's wrong, it will use this error to correct its world model, its local programming, such that it will predict it better next time. And so basically the signal progresses up through the hierarchy, and the error goes down, backwards down through the hierarchy again. Yes. If you're more interested, just stop the video and read this text. Now, moving along, one thing that's really, really important about this whole thing is that it implies we are doing active inference when perceiving the world. So what does this mean? So basically this means the brain actively tries, So active inference means the brain actively tries to generate new actions, meaning what should I do next, how should I act in this situation, and so on, to minimize long-term prediction error, meaning to basically try to be more accurate in predicting how the world works, meaning you have a more accurate world model. This sort of active inference is really important because this helps organisms, also humans, to become more effective in the world by learning how to act in a goal-directive manner. And also, this is interesting that Clark mentions there's this so-called self-structuring of information flows, which means that humans are not passively just waiting until some information hits them. So we're not just strapped into a chair and whatever we perceive is whatever is coming in front of us, but we actively move through the world and actively research out this piece of information or this type of insight. We choose to watch this thing or read this article. So we actively choose what sort of information we will get. And we use our world model to make this choice of what we should consume next in terms of information. And all of this in the context of what we're trying to achieve. So by this, organisms are able to interact with the world in a goal-directed manner, and also here they say goal-directed exploration, to not only improve their understanding of the world, but then continually use this understanding of the world to achieve certain goals. So basic goals, of course, of organisms is surviving, not dying, reproducing, and eating food and drinking water, let's say. And exactly, so this means the predictive internal world models guide our intention. And this then we use to pick up more information about the world, and then to learn more, and then to be more purposeful and more successful in our goal-directed pursuits. So there's one example which I found interesting just to sort of showcase this predictive mechanism of the brain. So basically there was this experiment where people would listen to some sound, someone talking, and then the scientists, they would replace some of the syllables with a coughing sound, and afterwards the subjects in the experiments, they were asked, like, did you understand what was being said, and where in the text sort of was this coughing sound. And actually all the subjects, they had no trouble whatsoever understanding everything that was said, even though pieces of the words were just missing. And so now the implication being that people were able to sort of predict the words that were being said by the whole context, by everything that has been said before, and by the pieces of the words that were being said. And so not only was this possible, but they were not able to accurately identify which phoneme, so which piece of the word had been disturbed. So they knew there was some coughing sound there, but the brain was able to just fill in the gap and just generate it itself to such that they didn't know what they were missing. And this gives at least some credibility. There's not a proof, but it's just an example of this concept where sort of, and this might also be happening right now, you're listening to these words and sort of maybe before I'm saying certain words, you already know what I'm going to say. And most of the time you will likely be correct. And sometimes when you're not correct, this will then send sort of an error signal inside of your brain, and then you will basically update your small model of basically what I'm saying, what I'm talking about. So really interesting. Just to summarize this, there's this predictive theory of the brain which says you have a world model inside of your brain that tries to generate the experience which you're having, and sort of tries to predict what the next second, the next microsecond you will see and you will hear and so on. And this means that you're not using all of your senses just to process information, but basically to control the hallucination which this generative model generates. Okay, really interesting stuff. And so far, this has been now some insight on the biology and neuroscience. So let's just give you, I'm trying to give you some background on how philosophy had viewed perception throughout history. So again, obviously, this is not complete. I'm not an expert in all of this, but still, I think it's instructive. It will be interesting to see these examples, because certainly before we did science the way we're doing it right now with neuroscience, with all of these fancy theories and these fancy experiments and machines, before all of this, philosophy was the only discipline that was thinking about these topics. So this is basically just the history of how we come to the place we are right now. So starting with Plato. So Plato, was an ancient Greek philosopher, and one of his main ideas was this idea of the Plato's cave, which is, okay, maybe I should have pulled up an image. Plato's cave, which is basically this idea that you're not seeing actual reality in this picture being the outside world, but you're these guys sitting inside of the cave, inside of here, and you're only merely looking at the shadows on the wall, which are generated by, in this case, this sort of, I don't know, these symbols, whatever. The idea being that direct reality is not accessible to you. You're merely seeing some sort of projection, some sort of something that's derived from reality, but it's sort of heavily transformed. And real reality is not accessible to humans. That's the idea. And then he had this idea that sort of the true forms, true ideas are outside of the cave, and you can only use philosophical reasoning and not sensory experience to get at these. And yeah. Moving on. Then Aristotle, he was actually a student of Plato. He had a bit of a different view. Basically said knowledge comes primarily from sensory experience of the physical world. And he also believed that Plato's forms do exist, but he believes that those are abstractions from particular things which are unreality. And Plato sort of viewed it differently, that these forms, they are real, and everything that we view is just a projection which we can see. So there's a bit of a difference here, but yeah, it's just a similar view in some sense. Then Locke, I think now looking back, was really impactful, really important, of course, but also sort of wrong. So Locke famously had this empiricist stance, meaning that knowledge of the external world is achieved through sensory experience rather than through reasoning and reflection of innate ideas. So as you see, this directly builds on Aristotle, and or Aristotle, I think they say in English, and most importantly, Locke had this concept of sensitive knowledge, and he believed that our senses provide reliable information about the existence of external objects. Argues that the immediate perception of an object through our senses gives us a degree of certainty about its existence. Right. Moving on, Kant now is really important. Now I feel like we come closer to a view of today. So Kant sort of was this critic of perception, and he said that human perception is shaped and is limited by our sensing instruments, which means our eyes, our brain, our ears, and sort of he says built-in constructs, which I would say sort of the structure of our brain. And it's impossible to really grasp at the actual object in the world, to really see the actual object, because we're always limited by our own sensory organs and basically the structure of our brain. And he also has this idea that minds actively structure our perceptions. He says, according to innate categories and forms of intuition, for example, space and time. Right. So the main idea being processes, perception is an active process, and we're limited by sort of basically human biology, let's say. Descartes also sort of builds on this, and he says our senses can deceive us, and even how we perceive our own body can be an illusion. And to him, the only thing that was undoubtedly clear was this idea of I think, therefore I am. You might have heard this. And sort of then he uses this foundation to rebuild knowledge, including the belief in an external world through reason and rational arguments. So you see that Descartes was now clearly sort of piece of the Enlightenment tradition, with particular emphasis on reason and rationality. And now I feel Nietzsche is a really important and interesting follow-up to this, because by his time, European philosophy, to some degree maybe you could say, had gone overboard with rationality and thought everything can be perceived rationally. And Nietzsche sort of, to me, balanced the scales again, or balanced the picture. So he says there are no facts and only interpretations. And he says there's no objective truth and there's no such thing as a neutral standpoint from which we could perceive reality. And he sort of had this perspectival view, or perspectivism, meaning there are all kinds of perspectives, and they are all sort of tainted, let's say, by the person doing the observation, the person doing the perception. And it is been particular influenced by sort of the values they have, and sort of their mind, how their mind is structured, the reality, the experience that they had, and so on. And also sort of their interests, their motivations, and their bodily desires even. And to him, this idea of objectivity, if at all, you could arrive at by looking at different perspectives and how different people view the world. And to me, really extremely interesting quote, which I found in his last book, Ecce Homo, where he basically says that what we don't know of, or what our internal world model in our brain does not contain, so this is a bit of my interpretation of what he says, so what we have never conceived of in our brain, what we've never experienced, what we just don't know about, is imperceptible. And it seems to us as if it doesn't even exist. And if we would know about it, or if we had sort of seen it before, someone told us about it, or we had learned about it, then we would see it. But without this sort of knowledge, without this prior experience, it's imperceptible. It's as if it doesn't exist. As if it's sort of transparent. So yeah, he says, a man has no ears for that to which experience has given him no access. And people will believe that where nothing is heard, nothing is to hear. So I'll leave you with this. I recognize this is not a complete picture on the philosophical part, but still this is just to sort of populate the backstory and how we got where we are right now. So psychology, again, I mean, if if you try to find out more about psychological or let's say the consensus of psychological literature on perception, this is closely linked with also neuroscience literature. So that's why I won't be going in deeply into this field here, but just give you some interesting overview, just a basic thing. So in psychology, there's this thing called constructivism, and that's basically says that the brain uses sensory data along with stored knowledge and expectations to generate a coherent interpretation of the environment. And this means that humans or individuals play an active role in constructing how they understand reality, how they view the world. So again, perception is based on your world model, and it's an active generative process, and it's an interpretative process. It's not merely, okay, this is the data and I just taken the data and now I know the truth, but it's impossible to know the truth as we've seen from the philosophy section. So the real thing is not accessible, and the only thing which we can perceive is how our mind perceives all of which we receive in our sensory organs. And also just note that whenever I say also receive signals, receive sensing, I also think of thoughts as well. So it's not just what can you see, what can you hear, but it's also you sort of also hear or whatever, perceive your own thoughts. So your own thoughts, they also really play into the sensing and into this perception. So again, the idea here from the constructive perspective is that you are combining everything that's sort of going on and which you're aware of, and even things you're not aware of, this is then where your subconsciousness comes into a holistic view, sort of your brain tries to build this holistic view and presents this to you in the form of your perception. And yes, according to the psychologist called Richard Gregory, these two guys, Hermann von Helmholtz and Wilhelm Wundt, they should take credit for realizing that perception is not just a passive acceptance of stimuli, but very much so an active process. And Richard Gregory also, so this is something I will now come to in the next section. He drew this interesting sort of connection between human perception and sort of the hypothesis and deductive process of scientific inquiry. And I will present my own take on this after this section. So lastly, in the psychology section, I'd like to present this thing. It's called Kanizsa triangle, and it's about illusory contours. So the original thing is the one on the top left, and as you can probably see, you probably see sort of this this triangle which points downwards, and this triangle is not actually here. Like, this image does not contain the triangle, but your brain still perceives this triangle because it's actively interpreting what it's seeing, and it's using its own world model to construct this perception which you have on the top left. And if you take away those circles on the outside, then at least to me, I don't see the downward facing triangle anymore. And if you look at the bottom left side, you sort of still see this triangle, but it's certainly harder. It's tougher to see. And then also I wanted to do this experiment on the bottom right, because I wondered, like, okay, is the reason we are viewing the triangle on the top left because we're sort of prompted to view a triangle because we view this other triangle which points to the top. So it could be that sort of since we view the contours of this other triangle, this sort of gives our brain an idea, okay, maybe like this other thing is also a triangle. And I don't know, take it for what you will. I mean, I think you certainly still can see the triangle on the bottom right. But also arguably it's more easy to see it on the top left. So whatever the reason for that is, maybe there's some influence of seeing a triangle like right here, and then also your brain guessing, okay, maybe the other thing is also a triangle. Maybe something like this is going on, but still, this is sort of an interesting example just to sort of showcase, again, like this generative, this interpretive, this based on your own world model, this internal world understanding view of perception, or how perception comes to be. Okay, all right, I think we've progressed well so far. So now I'd like to present to you the next topic, which is the link between Deutsch-Popperian epistemology and human perception. So in this section, I try to explain a connection I believe to have found between how the individual human perception works and how humanity as a whole uses the scientific method and our knowledge of epistemology to advance the collective knowledge of humanity. So first off, what's epistemology? So epistemology, it's a word for the study of what humans can know. And episteme is the Greek word for knowledge. And as you know, logi or logos means study. So it's a study of what we can know. It's quite a fundamental field, which is why it's one of the oldest. It's quite a fundamental question, which is why it's one of the oldest philosophical fields, going back all the way to ancient Greeks and probably even before them. So I don't have a great overarching education on epistemology, which is a shame. So I'm not able to give you a grand overview of all of this. So I'll just focus in on what Karl Popper, a philosopher, what his view was on epistemology, and particularly David Deutsch's interpretation of Karl Popper's epistemology. David Deutsch is a quantum physicist and an interesting guy overall. By the way, if you want to read his book, hugely recommend reading his book. Anyways, so the point will be here to draw a connection between the sense-making and perception in our human brain as individual humans and how humanity as a whole comes to acquire knowledge using a scientific method, using the perspective of Karl Popper. Now let me explain sort of David Deutsch's view of epistemology. So central to his view of epistemology is that scientific theories are centrally about good explanations, more so than they are about just making predictions about certain phenomena. So it's about explaining why a certain phenomenon which we are interested in works the way it does, more so than just predicting the outcome of this dynamic or of this phenomena. Because a prediction merely means that if you have a predictive model, it merely means that given some input, you can now predict some outcome with some approximate precision. But this does not tell you why it is or how it came to be that you reach this outcome. So it's sort of like a stupid machine. It just spits out the answer, but you never understand why this particular answer in this case comes to be. And an explanation, on the other hand, this sort of describes a story of why the phenomenon works the way it does. And an interesting, so something to consider on this difference is, let's say you have a perfect predictory model, a black box machine that 100% of the time predicts the weather of tomorrow correctly. And I have no predictive model. I merely have an explanation of how the weather works. And using this explanation, using this scientific theory, I can also try to predict the future weather, but I'm only correct 80% of the time. Now, the difference now being that while I'm wrong 20% of the time, I know approximately with this inaccuracy of 20%, I know approximately why the weather is the way it's going to be. I understand the dynamic, the functional relationships between everything that's involved, that together form this outcome of the weather tomorrow. And using this knowledge, I now am able to change the weather. I can now influence this phenomena. Since I know the functional relationships, now I know what should I manipulate in what way to approximately try to get some sort of outcome which I want. And if you only have a black box predictive model, that's great. Now you can predict the weather 100%. Certainly there are a lot of applications that only need a prediction, but you cannot change the weather itself because you have no idea how it works. So explanations give you power. They give you power to change what the explanations are trying to explain. And this means that explanatory power and scientific theories are sort of measured in their explanatory power. This is directly related to the power you gain through the explanations to change those aspects of reality. And applying explanatory power in a methodical way, or the explanatory power of our scientific theories, that's what we call technology. So technology uses what we know about electricity or whatever else to build something, to manipulate these phenomena to gain some sort of outcome which we like or which we want. So this is really interesting. This is really, really important. Now, building on that, David Deutsch says that science is advanced by conjecturing, which means a sort of guessing or creatively coming up with new explanations for some phenomena that might either explain hitherto unexplained phenomena, or maybe try to explain a phenomenon that already has some sort of explanation, but the explanation seems to be wrong in some sort of area, so clearly it's incomplete, and it's at least to some degree wrong. So people can come up, they can conjecture new explanations to try to come up with a more complete story, a new theory of how some phenomena comes to be. And using these new explanations, we can then go out and gather data, do experiments or whatever else, and then importantly to try to falsify the theory. So in science and epistemology and so on, the scientific method is not about proving anything, since we cannot prove anything. Since we can never be sure whether we maybe have missed something or maybe have overlooked something. So as a matter of principles, theories are never proven. Okay, never proven. The only thing we do is, using this explanation, we can now come up with a sort of experiment that tries to be clever in such a way to see whether the theory holds up and explains the phenomena well, or whether it's basically whether it's wrong. And if we fail to falsify a given theory or a given explanations for long enough, we temporarily say, okay, we accept it as true. It's probably true, pending further evaluation, pending new data, new experiments, and also new theories. And it might very well be that in the future a new theory will come along that explains the phenomena as far as we understood it so far, but also puts it into bigger context and then also addresses some issues which we came to find in the old theory. So for me, a classic, really interesting example is this shift from the Newtonian perspective on gravity to the Einsteinian perspective on gravity in Einstein's theory of general relativity. Secondly, theories are not derived from data. So it's not that we just have some sort of experiment, we have some data, we look at the data, and then we say, okay, now we can use this logical process to derive the correct explanation. So this is what's called inductivism. and it's general philosophical consensus, as far as I can understand, that inductivism, which has been around for a long time and which had been viewed as correct, it's actually wrong. Inductivism is wrong. Theories are not derived from data, but they are generated using a creative conjecture of the scientist, and then they are manipulated, and then we can see, okay, maybe they have some internal inconsistency here. I don't know, some mathematical formulas, they don't fit, so we need to work on it, and we need to improve it. And then we use this conjecture and try to falsify it using some sort of comparing predictions it did with experimental data we gathered. But the important point about this experimental data is that the theories themselves, the conjectures we come up with, they inform our data gathering process. So for this reason, it's not possible to induce the theory given some data, because the process that generated this data started off with some particular view of this phenomena. So the data is sort of tainted by whatever view influenced the data generating process. So just logically then, trying to deduce the theory from the data will only lead you to the theory that generated the data. So you can never go beyond that theory that generated all of this experimental data. That's why the conjecture of an explanation comes before the data gathering process. And the data gathering process is informed by this conjecture, and it's used to falsify it. And if we fail to falsify it, it might be true. And if it's falsified, it's definitely untrue. Also, So one, as I said, an interesting example here is just from the perspective of Newtonian gravity, we would have never looked for gravitational waves, since Newtonian gravity has no conception of a world where gravitational waves exist. So we would have never built those crazy machines that can detect gravitational waves. So it was necessary to first come up with this new idea of Einsteinian general relativity, and then we were able to actually perceive, to understand this aspect of reality. So exactly. So this is the connection here. This is the connection between human perception and the epistemology, as far as I believe to have found it, right? That in David Deutsch's view on epistemology, the conjecture comes first. So basically, an attempt at a new world model comes first, and then the perceptive process comes second, which is informed by this world model. Using some old world model, using some old theory, and having this inform our data gathering process, we are to some degree never able to go beyond this theory. So we might falsify the theory, we might use the theory to gather data, and then some data doesn't correspond to the predictions of this theory, so we can falsify it, and this informs us, okay, we need to come up with a new conjecture. But to generate wholly new experimental data, we first need to conjecture this new worldview. And to me, that there seems to be this connection, even if it's maybe just a small point. But in general, I don't know. I wonder if there's a fundamental reason why there's this connection, that humans are not able to perceive things beyond their own world model, which is a claim I will repeat shortly, and also humans as a whole are not able to generate knowledge before we generated sort of the possible world model, the potential different explanation, and then use this set of glasses, right, to use this lens which we thought at first, to then try to look at the world in a different way. Okay, now, right, moving on. Now I will come to this quote here and this picture, which I think is a sort of a good summary of the view on perception which I'm trying to present to you guys. So there's this guy, he's called Joscha Bach, he's on the top bottom left here. He's a cognitive scientist and an extremely smart guy, really, really interesting guy. I highly, highly recommend you guys watching this clip, or maybe watching the whole podcast episode of Joscha Bach with Lex Friedman. This is the first podcast they two did. And he has this quote where he says, "We as humans, we individual humans, we persons, exist inside the story the brain tells itself." And Joscha Bach, as far as I can explain it to you, has this view that your perception, how you view the world, this is a sort of a movie that your brain generates to try to tell a coherent story, combining all of the aspects, all of the sensing you do from the outside, all of the thoughts which you have, all of the emotions which you feel, all of your memories which you have, everything, and all of how you understand the world, all of this, your consciousness, your brain, your mind tries to combine into a coherent story, and you are part inside of the story. You are sort of a character inside of the story, and you sort of the movie that your brain is generating. It's not merely the movie of the outside, but actually how sort of your self-image, your self-view, your ego. In this image, they call it the illusory self. This is also generated, and this is part of this movie, which your brain generates to try to give you a coherent picture of how the world around you seems to be and how you are situated in the world. And in this view, the boundary, so this red line right here, between this generated perception of yourself and the generated perception of the world around, this boundary is actually an illusion. So there is no true clear boundary between the movie outside and the movie of you. Like, it's just one movie. And it's an illusion to say that the perception of you and the perception of the world are separated. And actually, like, if people take psychedelics and they have this ego dissolution, to some degree you can say the brain that is confused or whatever. Like, I mean, that's an interesting different topic, how psychedelics sort of seem to disinhibit interconnections in the brain. So you can look this up. I mean, I don't know. You can look this up, psychedelics. If you take psilocybin, magic mushrooms, the whole brain seems to light up and seems to be interconnected, how it is usually isn't. And this can lead to a state which people call ego dissolution, which then basically is only this red line here, this imaginary boundary line between the movie of yourself, your self-perception, and the perception of the world. This goes away for a moment. And then you feel like you're connected to the whole world. And you are connected to the whole world, but you're only connected to the whole world as it is generated by your brain. You're not in actuality connected to the actual world outside. So the blue boundary, this is the sort of movie, your world model. Also remember, like, the predictive processing hypothesis of the brain, which I alluded to earlier by Andy Clark. Like this blue thing here, this is the image this is the story, this is the movie your brain is generating. This is what you're seeing. And you're not seeing anything else. You don't see the actual true underlying, Kant called it, thing in itself. You're not seeing the actual true reality. You are seeing this generated movie. And inside of this movie, also you're seeing yourself, which also is generated. Right. Yes, and it's also interesting. The little man at the center of our world of experience is not the observer of the internal scene. It is merely an object made of the same substance as is the rest of the perceived scene. Because that scene would be incomplete without a replica of our own body in the world. But the perceptual homunculus, whatever that is more than a mere replica. So your perceived self is more than a mere replica of the physical body. It is a computational mechanism constructed by the brain to help it control the body. So, okay, now let's get to the summary. Putting all of this together. I will come back to this image later. Right. So, first off, perception is something that your brain does. It's an active process. And by this, it's also learned. How you perceive the world is something you learn. Which also means your perception of the world will change once you learn more about the world. So, the brain, as we've seen in the neuroscience part of this lecture, has a certain modularity. So, for example, there's the visual cortex, there is a motor cortex, there's the neocortex, is sort of up front here, sort of the executive piece, the rational or whatever piece of your brain, and there are all of these pieces of your brain, and your brain has this modularity, and that modularity is not absolutely predetermined, but generally it's structurally favored, let's say. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that. So, in my view, I believe that different sort of abilities have a different degree of structural biases, such that babies, once they're born, they either come equipped with those skills coming out of the womb, or it's relatively easy for them to learn that skill. So let's say, for example, identifying faces. It's a basic human skill. But this skill, even though humans are biased towards developing the skill, it still has to be learned. It still has to be learned. As you probably know, babies, once they're born, it's not like they're born with like perfect vision. They actually cannot view very far. They can maybe view like 20 centimeters or something like this. And they start to learn to view the world bit by bit. At first, it's more like a black and white scene, so they can view movement, or they can view light changes and certain colors they might identify earlier. And of course, humans generally all learn to identify faces, and it's relatively easy to learn it, but still it has to be learned. And I think the reason why these sort of basic skills are easy to be learned is that if you look at it from a sort of a Bayesian statistics, a machine learning view, it's sort of, you can frame it as those skills are easy to learn because the genetically determined structure of the brain forms what we call in machine learning inductive prior that makes certain points in the skill landscape, which is given by some sort of learning loss function, easily reachable using some basic expectable exterior stimuli. So this is probably maybe a bit of a convoluted sentence. So if you don't know machine learning and Bayesian statistics, don't worry about it. But basically, the idea is that you don't come pre-equipped with the skill to, let's say, recognize faces. But the way sort of your neurons and your visual cortex is structured, sort of the architecture, the neural architecture of the visual cortex, I believe, is such that given you see faces throughout the first 2 or 3 years of your life, if you see them, and usually you do, as a human being, it's quite easy, it's quite automatic that you really become an expert in identifying faces. Up to the point that, as you know, like it's really easy for people to spot a sort of a face-like structure even in clouds or whatever. And yeah, in my view is that there's a sort of a inductive prior, sort of a structural bias in the brain that allows us to learn some sort of basic preset abilities quite easily. It could be that some skills are so basic that they are literally just wired into the structure, like sort of in the factory settings. But most things, that's the main point. Most things have to be learned. Most things are learned. So yeah, most basic stuff is learned in the first 3 years, and I think we are predetermined to learn those quite easily. So let's say basic visual cognition, motor cognition, meaning walking, grasping, feeling, and so on. And also sort of embodied perceptions of feeling your body and knowing, like balancing and so on. Like, so all of this has to be learned, but it's relatively easy to learn. Auditory cognition, so learning to differentiate sounds and voices, and with that also language ability. Basic social cognition, so social cognition, emotional cognition, basic psychological self-regulation, so you feel emotions and you don't throw a temper tantrum all the time, at least if you have a decent education, whatever, and basic reasoning abilities also. So there are certainly like basic set of skills which are easily to learn, but still they have to be learned. And for most other things, I think it would be hard to argue that they are sort of preset. But since the human brain is the most general brain in the animal kingdom on this planet, we're basically able to almost seem to pick up any type of complex skill or knowledge and the accompanying perception. So the perception is then sort of allowed through this new knowledge which we pick up. So yeah. So as I said before, reading, like there's no reading center in the brain, but as we learn to read, a small subsection of the visual cortex will actually specialize on this skill. And this was sort of a sub-program of the brain will then know how to read, especially in this case in the visual cortex. And I also expect most other things, most other knowledge, skills, and so on to work similarly. So we might not be 100% general, and also this is the Kantian view of we are limited by our organs and also our brain in what we can perceive, but certainly the human brain seems to be really, really general in this learning ability. So all of this means that learning about the world, understanding how the world works, and learning to see the things we understand in the world, this gives us with a new specialized and more nuanced, broader perspective. More basically a new type of perception, new perceptive ability. And in my view, again, like this is not about theoretical knowledge. Theoretical knowledge is a precondition to applying this knowledge practically and also using careful observation. So not only knowing it, but then trying to learn to view it in the world. So actively, carefully observing it, and this is sort of like a muscle, and this then sort of trains us to perceive whatever we've learned in the world, and then sort of our perception becomes more broad, becomes more nuanced, becomes more specialized, and becomes more powerful, basically. Right, so perception is learned. Now, next point, perception is an active process based on a world model, and perception is motivated. So what does this mean? This means that using the process of perception, or the process of perception, basically is the brain trying to order what you see, what you take in the current context, so whatever you're seeing, whatever you're thinking, thoughts and feelings, and then try to give you this sensible picture, this story, right? The story the brain tells itself. And herein, the brain distills everything as best as it can into a coherent story. And in all of this, you are sort of one aspect of the story, you're one character in the story, but you take the central perspective of this character, which you are. So this means also it's a highly subjective process, and humans cannot escape this subjectivity of theirs, because we only exist inside of the story. So there is nowhere else where we could exist other than the story, which is generated inside of inside of our own brain, meaning we are necessarily limited to our own subjectivity. You can never escape your own subjectivity, because you only exist inside of it. And to make sense of it, of the world around us, your brain has learned a world model, an understanding of the world, and then using, or at least according to the predictive processing hypothesis, which is well established, the brain uses this generative model, this world model, to generate your daily experience and perception. And then it uses the sensory information, whatever you see, you hear, your thinking, and so on, to try to error correct this movie generator in your brain whenever it goes wrong. And this error correction then helps us to update and improve the world model which we have. And for anyone that knows machine learning, this is a really direct analogy to how a stochastic gradient descent works in machine learning. And one of the issues in all of this is that expectations, they shape our perception. Because an expectation, this is a piece of your world model, right? Your world model sort of predicts that some sort of outcome will likely come about. So this is your expectation. And this often leads then to confirmation bias. Because since this is your expectation, your perception is sort of geared towards perceiving this outcome. And other outcomes which might run counter to this, they are not even included inside of the story which your brain generates. So this is confirmation bias. So for this reason, it's really hard actually to update and to become better in your own world model, and then thus also improve your perception, unless you try to actively find some sort of weakness and irregularities and just somewhere where you're wrong in your current understanding. So this is confirmation bias. This is the reason why humans have confirmation bias. And in the view of Joscha Bach, your perception of self is a program that runs in the world simulation, which again runs inside of your brain, inside of your mind. And he views consciousness, as far as I understand, as sort of a ever momentary process. So consciousness is only in this moment, is a momentary process, which is the perception of our own perception. So we perceive that we're perceiving, and And this mechanism, this consciousness, he believes serves as a sort of coherency enforcer, which is in a way a different way of speaking, that we use errors in our predictive generative model in relation to what we sense from the outside world to update our own model. And this is how we learn. And this is how we learn to act in the world, and how we learn to go after our goals, let's say. And I would say, like, this aspect of human cognition and also psychology which arises from it is likely to be an evolutionary most optimal way of getting any sort of agent, and human beings are an agent. So we are an entity which has certain desires and feelings and general goals, and we exist in an environment, and we're trying to act in this environment to achieve some sort of goal, and the environment acts upon us, and sort of we have rewards and we have punishments. And so this is sort of this view of humans as an agent. So humans being an agent, or any sort of organism in evolution being an agent, we act in an environment to solve basically evolutionary tasks, which means we don't want to die until we reproduce. And over billions of years, literally, basically those organisms tended to reproduce, which were able to sort of correctly solve, or most optimally solve, the evolutionary task of reproducing their own genes. And humans are sort of, in this view, on top of this hierarchy, because due to our cognitive ability is so high that we perceive ourselves consciously as an agent. And through this modeling, through this movie that plays inside our head, we are most likely and most able to persecute our evolutionary goals. And of course, like, this advanced human cognition also have side effects, that we also have sort of goals and desires which don't directly seem to have an evolutionary standing, but that's merely a side effect, and not an intended effect of evolution. So yes. And now the next point, which I believe is really, really important, that perception is a motivated interpretative process of sensory information. Meaning, humans are an agent, right? We are a person with a set of wishes, desires, needs, which our human body or any animal has. So usually this is we are sort of in a process of seeking, gaining, consuming. So I'm hungry, I eat something. I'm horny and I seek sex. Basically, I want to reproduce. And I am fearful, so I run away or I defend myself, right? So so we have all these inborn sort of desires, which are based in our own human biology, in our animal body, which again is then based in evolutionary history. And as this agent, we use attention, which is a process which is motivated by the current set of goals, to gather information, or let's say set our consciousness, our conscious attention, our conscious mind up on what we deem to be most likely to be helpful to us to achieve the current given goal. So sort of attention is sort of directing what sort of information to consume next, which we deem to be most likely to help us in attaining our current goal. And then motivated and embodied perception is sort of seen as this tendency of the brain to group and recognize objects according to how they relate to our current goal, meaning how could we use those as a tool. And also in this, we have a strong focus to categorize any given object by their function, in the sense of the function to achieve our own goals, and also how we can manipulate them with our own brain. So sort of ironically, this cup doesn't have a handle, but like we perceive this as a cup, since it has the function of holding water, and also intuitively I perceive it as something I can grasp. So this is this embodied perception. And so also this also means attention, motivation, perception is usually humans being sort of being animals with hands, let's say, and hands being sort of really general purpose tools. Our perception and our consciousness is quite closely linked, and we tend to understand objects by way of their function. Okay, so I hope this comes across. Yeah. Now, this next point I believe is maybe one of the most important. Meaning, in any given context, in any given situation, you have some sort of current desire, current goal, current pursuit, and in this, your brain tries to help you in attaining this goal by ordering and prioritizing aspects of reality which you become aware of in the process of perception, and such that it shows you what do I say? Your brain orders and prioritizes aspects of reality in the perception it shows you in accordance with what you are currently trying to achieve. So this is motivated perception. Meaning, I want to get food, so I become aware of sort of means to attain food. So I become aware in my brain, do I have food in the fridge? Do I need to go to the supermarket? Do I need to grab my spear and hunt a deer to get food? Do I need to build a fire and then cook the meat of the deer? And so on. So just be aware that however you're perceiving the world in this current moment is heavily influenced by whatever sort of you consciously or subconsciously are currently trying to achieve or pursue or attain. And yeah, this means your brain is constantly in this process of trying to help you achieve this by bringing into attention and into your perception what it deems that might help you. And also this also means it filters out anything else which is deemed to be irrelevant. And this filtering process in particular can go wrong. And sometimes to solve some particular task, your brain sort of over-focuses on certain aspects, which means that other aspects which could help you solve whatever you're trying to solve, you can't perceive them. You're not aware of them. It's as if they wouldn't exist. So sometimes, as you guys know, it's necessary to take, let's say, a shower and just forget about your current topic, and then sort of this filtering mechanism will be disabled again. Then you might come up with a more creative solution. But in general, motivated perception means that your brain orders whatever stimuli it gets and prioritizes those aspects it deems most important to the attainment of your current goal. Which also means that this is also dependent on your worldview. And having a more accurate worldview also means that your brain is more able to correctly prioritize and filter, to prioritize important signals and filter out unimportant signals. So yeah, perception is an active process. It's based on your world model and it is motivated. And this brings us to the conclusion, which is I want to make in particular, that you are sort of blind and deaf to thousands of different aspects of reality in your everyday life because you are missing the knowledge to interpret the signals which are in theory there, and you could see it. Theoretically, it would be possible. It's not like it's out of reach. You might be seeing all of these things in theory and hearing it every day, but since you're missing the knowledge, the piece of your world model is incorrect, is incomplete, to interpret these signals correctly, you're completely unaware of whatever phenomena it is that's going on. And sort of a countless number of phenomena which right now you're oblivious to. Just to you, it doesn't exist. But it only doesn't exist because it doesn't exist inside of this movie, inside of which you exist. So there's no way for you to ever know it. So it's not your fault. But this means that you would need to acquire knowledge to augment your internal worldview, your internal world model, to then enable you to perceive this aspect of reality. So this, again, comes back to the Nietzsche quote of a man has no ears for that to which experience has given him no access, and people will believe that where nothing is heard, there's nothing to hear. So I interpret this experience part a bit more broadly. So meaning it's not just experience, you don't necessarily need to experience it. So, and maybe also Nietzsche meant it this way, I'm not sure. But you don't necessarily have to have experienced it yourself before. Also, it's a bit tautological. Because how can you experience it if you are not able to experience this is because you never experienced this before. So I would interpret this more generally, just saying something which you're completely oblivious to, you've never heard of, you have no idea of, you don't have the slightest idea about. It's just impossible for your brain to put together the puzzle pieces of signals to construct this piece of the perception. So this for you, sort of in your subjective factual reality, it doesn't exist. So if you say it doesn't exist, it's true. This is a true statement for you. You only live inside of your own subjective experience, inside of this movie inside of your head. And it's true, it does not exist where you exist. And you would need to augment your perceptive ability by augmenting your world understanding to be able to perceive it, to be able to generate it inside your own mind movie. So this could mean you spend endless hours with some friend of yours, and then at some point in life you learn about how personality in humans works. So for example, you might learn the 5-factor model, and now suddenly you can conceptualize and see some side of your friend which you could have in theory seen all along. I mean, you've spent all this time with this friend of yours, but you were just missing the critical knowledge to piece together all these signals and to make sense of them. So to you, they were filtered out, they never became part of your experience movie. So you never seen it before, but once you learn about this topic, let's say personality, and more structurally how personality works in humans, you then start to actually see it all around in the whole world. You will now talk to a colleague of yours, you see, okay, this colleague is agreeable and he's extroverted, but he is, less conscientious or whatever. So, and it's not just having labels, it is also having labels. I mean, that's a piece of understanding, because labels represent a sort of a explanation. So yeah, but yeah, it's literally impossible to see what you don't understand. That's the main point. So this means we are walking through life thinking that whatever is there we can perceive. But this view is wrong. So, and it's actually wrong in two ways. So it's wrong that whatever you don't perceive does not exist. That's wrong. There are actually way more things going on that you can perceive currently. So reality is much broader, much more deep, much more nuanced, much more detailed than you can currently perceive. So way more is going on, believe me. And now as you become aware of this fact of your own perception, you will now also become aware of, okay, with growing knowledge, my perception, the horizon of my perception, if you want, also grows. And this will also be true now for the topic of perception, as you've seen this lecture now. And it's also wrong in the other way, that some things that you do perceive, it can also be that they are not existent. that it's actually wrong. Those things don't exist. But they exist inside of your own experience, inside of your internal movie, because you have an understanding of the world, an explanation of the world that generates this perception. But this theory or this hypothesis, this model, this piece of your generative world model, it can be wrong. It can be wrong. It can be that you believe a wrong theory, a wrong view on the world. And this also means this piece of the perception, which stems and is generated from this piece of your world model, is going to be wrong. So you will probably, and this is true for all of us, probably, or actually, strictly speaking, it is true for all of us, that some things of what you believe to be existent, it's not existent. It doesn't exist. It's wrong, and it's due to a error in your world model. Right. So really important. And by the way, this also means that you can never be too sure about what you think is real, and you should never be 100% sure that this is how it is, because you by virtue of how we now know that perception works, you are incapable of seeing that you might be wrong in some aspects until you learn new aspects of reality, which then lead you to conclude that, okay, I'm actually wrong in this aspect. So it's quite tough. And yeah, and also now, if you factor in also like this tendency for a confirmation bias, which humans have, you can quite easily come to understand that we can get sort of stuck inside of our own perception. And this now also brings us to this point of tautology. And so if you remember the first episode, a tautology is something that proves itself. It's something that points towards itself. It's something that supports itself, right? So any sentence usually needs a different sentence to prove itself, to hold itself up. The only sentences which don't need anything else, so jokingly I put it is what it is in here. So this is a tautology. It is what it is. You don't need a different sentence to prove the sentence. The sentence proves itself. And perception also tends to have this, not strictly speaking, because you can learn more about the world and then you can actually augment your perception, but it tends to have this dynamic of a sort of a tautology where you only perceive what your world model allows you to perceive, and due to the frequent occurrence of sort of confirmation bias, because you expect to perceive what your world model predicts, you tend to perceive exactly those things which then come to confirm and not falsify your existing understanding of the world, your existing perception. So I think this is actually, it is in part a good and in part a bad thing. I mean, of course, it's a bad thing because it's then tough to update our world model and become more accurate, and we might get stuck in worldviews which are actually wrong. But since they usually don't allow us to view the world in a different way than in whatever way they are confirmed, it's tough to break out of this worldview. But of course, also this is a good thing, because it's good to have a stable perception of the world. Because if your perception of the world would change every 5 minutes, you just basically thinking of yourself as an animal in an evolutionary environment, you couldn't function. So you need some sort of stability in your perception. So it's good that the perception has this sort of tautological, self-proving or self-stabilizing dynamic, but also there are drawbacks to this. So in the sort of scientific spirit, it's always necessary to be vigilant and to try to actively, not all the time maybe, but to try to actively go ahead and falsify some pieces of your worldview in the attempt to enlarge your perspective. This, last point also means that bootstrapping knowledge from mere observation works to a point, but this takes a lot of time and reflection. Because you would have to, on your own, need to do all of the conjecturing and then use the conjecturing to interpret whatever you're seeing in the world, or generate data, or view the world from the perspective or whatever your conjecture you're trying out. And this just takes way too long, way longer than a single human lifetime lasts. So that's why actually human knowledge, and more than human knowledge, actually human cognition, individual cognition. So how you think, even how you feel, is a sociological phenomena. Why do I say this? I say this because knowledge, most of the knowledge you have, is actually transmitted sociologically, meaning other people have told you, other people have done something and you've seen them do it, so you basically learn from them. And you speak to people, you don't use your own language, you use language that has been there before, which is used in a society. And the language sort of gives you sort of these pre-built building blocks of thoughts, such that most of your thoughts actually aren't original, although you can generate original thoughts, but usually they aren't. And usually even original thoughts are just novel, interesting combinations of existing building blocks, and then maybe, let's say, you invent a new building block sometimes, usually not, but sometimes. And this way sort of, and then you interact with other people, so this way sort of we push collectively the knowledge horizon outwards, and that's also our perception horizon. But yeah, that's why humanity needs knowledge transfer across disciplines, across generations, inside of our societies, inside of human population, to kickstart each other's perception, and then to combine the knowledge and new observations which individual peoples do into new knowledge again, and thus again new perception. Right, so maybe this is also an interesting point to you, that most of the thoughts you have, they're not original, and you couldn't think without basically the collective knowledge of which you've consumed from humans, or at least without a minimal viable amount of the collective knowledge, which is also encoded in our human language, which has been developing for at least 10,000, I mean probably like 50,000 years. Okay, so putting all together, my understanding of perception is a learned process. Perception is learned, which also means if you learn more, your perception also progresses. And perception is a momentary, active process whereby you use your internal world understanding, your worldview, your world model, to interpret the signals and try to predict the next signals which you get, which then leads to your brain generating this experience, this perception, this movie inside of your brain, including the self-perception, including the perception of who you are, what you are, how you act, where you stand, how you are situated in the scene. And you exist actually only inside of this movie that is generated inside of your own brain. And really importantly also, this perception is motivated, meaning whatever you're currently trying to attain or desire, and this can be consciously or subconsciously, this actively influences your perception. So let's say you could be hungry, but you're not really consciously aware. This still might leave you to perceive, I don't know, like you could be unconsciously craving salt. So you're just sort of saying, okay, I don't know, you become aware, okay, maybe I could buy some chips which are salty. But and if this desire wouldn't be there, if like your perception wouldn't have been motivated by this existing desire in this moment, you wouldn't have become aware of let's say the chips in the shopping aisle in the supermarket. And also an implication of all of this, particularly deriving from that you use your internal world model to shape this internal movie, this implies that you are actually there are actually so much more phenomena going on. There are thousands of different aspects of reality which you just simply do not perceive, and as far as you are concerned, they are not existent. Even though in the outside reality and different people with different perspectives, this again now is Nietzsche's perspective, they can actually perceive it because their world model is geared towards the perception of these aspects of reality. So this is also sort of a motivation for you to continually learn more about the world, to be able to be less and less wrong about your perception of the world. And thus also, since we know sort of perception and scientific understanding gives us, and the explanatory power behind all of this, behind knowledge about the world, this gives us a power to act in the world and to achieve whatever we try to achieve and to fulfill our desires, our wishes. So I would argue there's a direct motivation for each and every human being to continually increase and broaden their understanding of the world, enabling them to perceive more aspects of the world, then enabling them to act using more of the aspects and more of the tools at which the world itself provides you. Okay, that's perception as I view it. I will finish this off with two quick examples, which I think are interesting and also just drive the point further home. So in Africa, I don't know which tribe, but we know there's a tribe which is not able to separate between different hues of green and blue. They literally don't have a concept of green, I think, is the thing which they don't have a concept of. They only know blue and some shades, some things which we would deem green, they would say this is also blue. And so this means basically they don't have the category of green in their world model, so they literally cannot see the difference between green and blue, which what we would say is the difference between green and blue. And so basically, and also I think there's this historical development where humans used to not have like all of the colors which we have right now. And as you know, like today there are like thousands of colors. I mean, there are like thousands of shades of blue. There's turquoise and whatever, or turquoise or whatever. And there's beige, and whatever else. There's orange. And prior to humanity developing the concepts of orange, we and let's say we only have a concept of red and yellow, and we don't have a concept of orange. We don't actually see orange. It's really impossible to differentiate orange from some shade of yellow or some shade of red. So this is just a simplistic example of you need a concept, you need an understanding, you need sort of a category, and categories also are a sort of an explanation or a sort of a world model, a world understanding. You need that to perceive the difference. Otherwise, you simply don't see it. Second understanding, yes, okay, I already alluded to this. So yeah. Whenever you learn a new concept or understand a new field, you then afterwards start to see these aspects everywhere. You feel like, why have I never seen this before? And this is due to perception. This is because since you now learned this, you are now able to generate, let's say, this aspect inside of your own mind movie. Okay. Right. So this will be it for the lecture. This concludes the lecture. Thank you so much for your attention. I think this lecture has gone on for quite a while now. I hope you found it helpful. I found you found it for you to just reflect on what you've heard today, and also try to actively see how perception works in this way. So really try this. That's what I meant in the beginning. Please try to embody it. Please try to feel it. Please try to learn the intuition of how this perception of yours works. And ironically, yes, you can use now your new knowledge of perception to perceive, to observe that your view on your own perception and your view of how your view of the world comes about is now changing as you've now attained this new knowledge of the world. So thank you very much for watching. Please give this video a like, thumbs up if you liked the lecture. Please also consider subscribing to the channel, so you and also hit the bell so you get notified once I upload the next video. The next video will be on a topic I call the emptiness of physical universe in human religions. So this will be more of a sort of a philosophical topic. It will deal also with the sort of the topic of nihilism. So I think this will be really, really interesting. Afterwards, I will be talking in the video after this, I will be talking about systems thinking, which is also really, really important. I think this will also be quite instructive to you. But for now, we've learned the concept of perception, which now gives us a foundation to understanding how it is we come to perceive the world, which then becomes really, really important in shaping what I call our tautology, my tautology, your tautology, which is your approach to life, your approach to viewing life, your understanding of life, and your understanding of yourselves, what you like, what your desires are, what your innate talents are, and combining all of this into one holistic, coherent, stable, self-proving and self-stabilizing view, enabling you to approach life and act life such that you achieve what you yourself deem a good life. And yes, as I said, foundational to this is the understanding of how you come to perceive life. So that's it for this perception video. And yeah, again, please like this video if you like it, consider subscribing, and until the next one, bye bye.